The smell of sizzling beef and fresh bread filled the air as the evening rush began at Grill Haven, a popular burger joint in the heart of the city. The warm glow of pendant lights reflected off the sleek countertops, and the steady hum of conversation mixed with the rhythmic clatter of the kitchen. At the back of the line, a man in a simple hoodie and jeans adjusted his baseball cap, keeping his head low. Michael Harrington, the billionaire CEO of Grill Haven, had built his empire from the ground up, yet no one in the restaurant recognized him. That's exactly how he wanted it. Tonight, he wasn't the powerful executive behind the franchise, just another customer. He wanted to experience his restaurant the way his patrons did. But just as he stepped forward to place his order, he heard something behind him that made his blood run cold. "Dude, I'm starving, but we don't have enough money." Michael turned slightly, catching sight of two young boys huddled near the menu board, their clothes worn and their voices laced with quiet desperation. One clutched a few crumpled dollar bills, while the other scanned the prices with uncertainty. His grip on his wallet tightened. He had come here to observe. But suddenly, he realized he was about to uncover something far more important than a customer's experience. Michael Harrington stood at the center of the bustling Grill Haven kitchen, his gaze fixed on the flurry of activity. The chefs worked with precision, flipping burgers, sautéing onions, and assembling orders with swift hands. The air was thick with the scent of charred beef and melted cheese. It was a far cry from the boardrooms and glass towers of the corporate world he was accustomed to. Yet, it was here, in this humble restaurant, where he felt closest to the business he had built from scratch. Years ago, Michael was just another struggling entrepreneur, a young man with a vision, trying to make ends meet, with nothing but a dream and an old recipe book passed down from his grandmother. He opened the first Grill Haven location in a tiny corner of the city, a modest affair with a handful of tables and an old grill. He poured every ounce of his energy into making it work. Early mornings, late nights, sacrifices, failures, and relentless determination. His vision was simple: to create the best burger joint in the world, one that could stand the test of time. Fast forward a decade, and Grill Haven had transformed into a franchise empire. Dozens of locations spanned the country, and Michael had become a household name. His face appeared on magazines, his words echoed through industry podcasts, and his success was talked about in business circles. Yet, despite all the wealth and recognition, Michael felt a growing emptiness gnawing at him. The excitement of expansion had worn off. In its place was a cold, isolating pressure to keep scaling, to keep pushing forward, to keep pleasing investors. He had everything money could buy: luxurious homes, sleek cars, vacations in exotic locations. But what good was any of it if it didn't bring him peace? There were days when he felt like a ghost in his own life, surrounded by people who only wanted a piece of his success, not the man himself. The deeper he dove into corporate meetings, the further he distanced himself from the people who had made Grill Haven what it was: the workers, the customers, the community. So, after weeks of internal struggle, Michael made a decision, one that seemed almost absurd considering his wealth and status. He would go undercover. He wasn't interested in the surface-level feedback from market surveys or focus groups. He needed to experience Grill Haven the way a regular customer would, to understand the heart of his business once again. No more board meetings or press interviews. No more company events. He wanted to witness the joy, the struggles, and the reality of those who worked for and patronized the brand he'd built. Grill Haven had started as a family business, and in many ways, it still felt like one to Michael. Yet, the family had grown too large, too corporate, and Michael had lost touch with the very essence that made his business special. That's why he stood at the counter now, eyes scanning the menu, wondering if tonight would provide the answers he needed, or if it would make him question everything he thought he knew about himself. As Michael listened to the soft, almost inaudible voices behind him, the weight of their words settled into the pit of his stomach. The two boys, no older than 12 or 13, stood hesitantly in front of the menu board. Their eyes darted between the prices, and Michael could see the tension in their faces. The kind of tension that only comes when you're trying to stretch a few dollars farther than they can go. One boy, taller with dark hair that hung over his eyes, held a crumpled $5 bill tightly in his hand. The other boy, smaller and wearing shoes with soles worn thin, glanced anxiously at the cashier as if he were afraid to speak. They had clearly come here with hope, only to find themselves on the edge of disappointment. "Dude, I'm starving, but we don't have enough money," the taller boy muttered, his voice low but heavy with frustration. He looked down at the bill, then at the prices on the menu. A small frown tugged at his lips. Michael turned slightly, as though trying to get a clearer picture of their situation without being noticed. He had seen his share of struggles. He had lived through them, after all. His own childhood wasn't easy, and he knew what it felt like to go without. But seeing these boys, standing on the verge of disappointment, was like a punch to the gut. They weren't asking for much. They weren't demanding a free meal, just hoping for something affordable. But the prices here weren't made for anyone but middle-class families or higher. Grill Haven was a place for people to treat themselves, to indulge in a quick meal with friends. It was never meant to be a refuge for those struggling to make ends meet. Yet, standing there, watching these two boys, Michael realized something he had long ignored. Grill Haven, for all its success, was not a place for everyone. He shifted uneasily. The guilt gnawed at him. This wasn't just an oversight in pricing or business strategy. This felt deeper, more personal. These kids had no way of knowing the man they were standing behind was the one who had created this very place. No way of knowing that he had the power to change their night. And as much as Michael wanted to walk away, to keep his distance, something inside him urged him to act. But how? What could he possibly do in this moment that wouldn't feel like a patronizing gesture? Before he could decide, the taller boy glanced at the menu one more time, then spoke in a whisper. "I guess we'll have to go." His voice trailed off, defeated. Michael's heart raced. The words seemed to echo in his mind. "We'll have to go." It felt like a decision was being made on his behalf, one that didn't have to happen. He could stop it. He could step in. But that would mean revealing who he was, and with it, the risk of not being seen for who he truly was. The moment held. Everything in the restaurant felt like it had slowed down, waiting for him to make his move. This was a turning point, the moment where Michael could choose to remain anonymous, continue the charade, and walk away, or where he could reveal himself, not just as a CEO, but as someone who believed in the values his company claimed to stand for. The decision was coming fast, and it would change everything. The moment of hesitation passed, and Michael took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what had pushed him to act. Maybe it was a look of disappointment in the boy's eyes, or perhaps it was the weight of everything he had been avoiding. For weeks now, he had been struggling with his role as CEO. The success of Grill Haven had brought him wealth, recognition, and status, but it had also built a wall between him and the real world. The real struggles. The people he had once cared for deeply, the ones he had started the company for, were slipping further and further from his reach. Michael took a deep breath and cleared his throat. He turned to face the cashier, keeping his voice calm and steady, as though he were a regular customer instead of the man who owned the place. "I'll take care of their meal," he said, his words feeling almost foreign to him. The cashier looked at him with a quick glance of confusion, unsure whether he had heard correctly. Michael nodded toward the boys. "Their meal, whatever they'd like." He dropped a $100 bill onto the counter. "Make sure it's covered." The cashier hesitated for a moment, then gave a polite nod. "Sure, sir. I'll handle it." Michael stepped aside, watching as the boys approached the counter. Their confusion was palpable. The taller boy, who had spoken earlier, scanned the bill again, his brow furrowed. Excuse me," he said tentatively. "Are you sure? I mean, we didn't ask for charity." Michael smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through him. "It's not charity, just a gift. Enjoy your meal." The boys exchanged uncertain glances, then nodded slowly, almost in disbelief. Michael watched them walk to a nearby booth, still looking back, unsure whether to trust the offer. It was a simple act, paying for their meal, but in that moment, it felt like everything was on the line. The small part of him that still longed for human connection felt lighter. The barrier he had spent years building between himself and others cracked ever so slightly. But as he turned back toward the kitchen, Michael's mind raced. Had he done the right thing? Sure, he'd helped the boys, but was this gesture enough? He had been so focused on his empire, his numbers, his meetings, that he had lost sight of what it meant to make a real difference. Paying for a meal wasn't a grand gesture. It was just a temporary fix. What about the bigger issues? The systemic problems? The inequality that kept people like those boys from even walking through the door to begin with? It was then that the weight of his decision truly hit him. Helping one or two kids here, and there was a drop in the ocean of the larger societal problems. What if he had to do more? What if his responsibility as a CEO was more than just about profits and growth? What if the true measure of success wasn't in the bottom line, but in the impact he had on people's lives? Michael spent the next few hours and days moving mechanically through his duties in the restaurant, trying to focus on the daily operations. But every few minutes, his mind would return to the boys, to their faces, to the look of gratitude they had given him. He found himself replaying the scene over and over, wondering if they truly understood that their meal had been paid for by the very person who had built this place. When the dinner rush began to slow, Michael found himself standing by the back door, watching the boys leave the restaurant, their faces now brighter than before. They waved goodbye to the cashier, the taller one flashing a shy smile toward Michael as he stood in the corner. Michael gave them a nod but didn't approach. He couldn't. Not yet. As the restaurant emptied out and the night wore on, the questions inside Michael only deepened. His instincts had led him to help the boys. But what about the deeper, long-term problems? What about his employees who worked tirelessly but struggled to get by? What about the communities his restaurant served, many of which faced poverty, hunger, and hardship? Michael knew he couldn't keep avoiding the issue. He had been so consumed with numbers, with expanding Grill Haven into a national force, that he had ignored the very people who had made it possible. In his pursuit of growth, he had neglected the soul of his business, the people. As the weeks passed, Michael made it a point to spend more time in his restaurants. He showed up unannounced, blending in with the staff and customers. He wanted to understand what life was truly like on the front lines of Grill Haven, the life of the servers, the cooks, the janitors. He watched how they interacted with customers, how they handled stress, and how they found moments of joy in the chaos. One afternoon, he visited a location in a rougher part of town. The moment he stepped inside, the noise of the crowded dining room hit him. Plates clinking, conversations buzzing, and the sound of fryers sizzling. But it wasn't the noise that caught his attention. It was the exhaustion in the eyes of the staff. They were running on fumes, yet their faces were filled with determination. Michael sat down at the counter, ordering a burger like any other customer, but his mind was elsewhere. As he watched the staff, a sinking feeling took root in his chest. He knew these workers weren't making nearly enough to live comfortably. They were the backbone of his business, but they were barely getting by. One of the waitresses, a woman named Karen, came over to take his order. Her smile was warm, but there was a weariness in her eyes that spoke volumes. As she set his food down, he asked, "How's everything going here?" She hesitated for a moment, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "You know that's tough. We're working as hard as we can, but some days it's just not enough. Rent's going up, bills keep piling up, and, well, we don't get much help. We do what we can, but sometimes it feels like we're invisible." Michael nodded, feeling the weight of her words. The realization hit him hard. These people weren't just employees. They were families, individuals with lives outside of Grill Haven. They had dreams, struggles, and hopes, and he had been blind to that for so long. That evening, Michael walked into his office, feeling an unfamiliar sense of resolve. It wasn't enough to just keep expanding or driving profits. He needed to create a company that cared for its people, its workers, its customers, and the communities it served. He didn't know exactly how he would do it, but the first step was clear. He spent the next few weeks planning, not just for financial growth, but for systemic change. He restructured employee benefits, ensuring better pay, health care, and support for workers. He created a new initiative called Grill Haven Cares, aimed at providing resources to underprivileged communities. And for the first time in years, he didn't just focus on the future of the business. He focused on the future of the people it served. Through all of it, Michael found himself changed. He had started out with a desire to observe, to understand his business better. But what he found was far more profound. He had discovered a purpose beyond the spreadsheets, beyond the corporate meetings. It was a purpose rooted in the people who had built his business, and in those whose lives it touched. Weeks had passed since Michael had launched Grill Haven Cares, and the changes had already begun to take root. Workers were feeling more valued. Customers were responding to the company's new community outreach programs, and for the first time in a long while, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was proud of what he had accomplished, but there was one thing he had yet to address: the deeper issue that had ignited this whole journey. Grill Haven was thriving, but Michael knew it could do more. It should do more. The money, the restaurants, the brand, all of it. It was meaningless unless it could truly make a difference in the communities it served. The problem was, he was still struggling to balance the demands of his role as CEO with the urgency of creating real, lasting change. It was easier to implement a few programs, give employees some benefits, and write checks for charity. It was much harder to tackle the deeply entrenched inequalities that kept many of his workers and their families trapped in cycles of poverty. But he hadn't anticipated the bombshell that would drop into his lap. It came one afternoon, just as he was finishing up a meeting with his senior team. A phone call, urgent and fast-paced, sent a chill through his spine. "Michael," the voice on the other end was frantic. "You need to get down here. There's a protest outside one of the Grill Haven locations. They're demanding better wages for employees, and the media's already starting to cover it." The words hit Michael like a freight train. A protest. The workers were speaking out, and it was no longer just a small, isolated group. It was bigger than that now. They were demanding what they had deserved all along: higher wages, better working conditions, a fair chance. And the media coverage? That made it all the more difficult to hide behind corporate jargon and spin. Michael's heart raced. He'd spent months laying the groundwork for change, but he hadn't anticipated this level of unrest. He hadn't thought that the workers would push back so hard, so fast. He had wanted to make an impact, to address the disparities, but he never expected to face the raw, public challenge of having to prove it. He grabbed his jacket and left the office without a second thought. His mind raced as he drove to the location. Would the workers be angry with him? Did they feel betrayed? Had his efforts been too little, too late? When he arrived, the scene was chaotic. A group of workers, some holding signs that read "Fair Wages Now" and "Grill Haven Cares." Prove It had gathered outside the restaurant, chanting and raising their voices. Cameras flashed from every direction. News outlets were already filming. The tension was palpable. This wasn't a peaceful rally anymore. It was an emotional plea for dignity. Michael stepped out of his car, trying to maintain control. He wasn't just Michael Harrington, the CEO now. He was the man who had promised them more, and he needed to own that. As he walked toward the front of the crowd, workers recognized him. Whispers spread like wildfire. Some faces lit up with cautious hope, while others looked at him with frustration and distrust. A woman stepped forward, her face tight with emotion. It was Karen, the waitress from the location he had visited months ago. She didn't hesitate. "We're still waiting for you to make good on those promises, Michael. You said things would change. But this is where we are now. Tell us why we should believe you." Her words cut deep, and for a moment, Michael felt a cold wave of guilt. He had pushed for change, but in the heat of his corporate world, he had missed the real, urgent needs of those who had stood by Grill Haven from the start. She was right. The changes had been slow, piecemeal, and not enough to transform their lives in a meaningful way. The crowd murmured in agreement. They wanted more. They needed more. For the first time in months, Michael felt the weight of the responsibility he had been running from. This wasn't just a PR opportunity or a chance to prove to investors that he cared. This was about people's lives. This was about the workers, the ones who had believed in him, in Grill Haven's promise to lift them up. A reporter shoved a microphone in his face. "Michael, can you respond to the workers' demands? Do you think Grill Haven has done enough to address the pay disparity and working conditions?" The eyes of the workers were on him now. Every face watching, waiting for his answer. He could feel the pressure building, the weight of the moment pressing down on his chest. There was no escaping it. No more hiding behind corporate talk or vague promises. It was time to take ownership, not just of the company's success, but of its failures as well. Michael took a deep breath. "You're right," he said, his voice steady but raw. "I haven't done enough. I've been so focused on growing this business that I forgot the most important part. The people who make it all possible. The workers who show up every day and pour their hearts into this company. I'm not here to make excuses. I'm here to listen, to learn, and to fix this." The crowd grew quiet, sensing the shift in his tone. Karen raised her eyebrows, challenging him. "And how are you going to fix it, Michael? We need real change, not more empty words." "I've already started," Michael replied. "We're raising wages for all employees, effective immediately. We're also providing better health care, expanding benefits, and creating a profit-sharing program that will allow workers to have a stake in the company's success. But that's just the beginning. We're going to overhaul our policies from the top down to make sure that everyone at Grill Haven has an equal opportunity, whether they're in the kitchen or at the counter. No more delays, no more half measures." There was a collective murmur in the crowd, but this time it was different. It was filled with cautious optimism, a spark of hope that hadn't been there before. Michael felt the burden lift slightly as the workers began to nod, their eyes softening, some even smiling. Karen stepped forward and gave a small nod of approval. Michael didn't know if this was enough to completely win them over, but he knew it was the first step toward earning their trust back. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, he was facing the truth. No longer hiding behind his position, but standing in the midst of those whose lives he had impacted. And in that moment, he understood that this was the kind of leadership that truly mattered. Not the business deals or the expansion plans, but the people, the ones who made everything possible. This wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a new beginning. And Michael Harrington, for the first time in years, felt ready to embrace it fully. 5 years later, Grill Haven was no longer just a chain of restaurants. It had become a symbol of corporate responsibility and community empowerment. The programs Michael had started had grown, reaching beyond the local neighborhoods to national initiatives. The job training programs continued to provide opportunities for young adults, and a new scholarship fund helped dozens of students attend college who otherwise wouldn't have had the chance. Karen, now a senior manager at Grill Haven, had become an advocate for employee rights, working alongside Michael to create more pathways for internal growth. She often said that the company had given her a family, not just a job. Michael, too, had changed. He had learned to balance business with purpose, family with work, leadership with empathy. He had become a sought-after speaker on the topics of ethical leadership and social impact, but he never lost sight of what truly mattered. The people who had been with him from the beginning. The restaurant on that corner, once a quiet local eatery, now stood proudly as the heart of a thriving community, a place where employees were more than workers and customers were more than patrons. They were partners in a shared mission. As Michael stood in front of the building on a quiet evening, watching families walk in, laughing and chatting, he reflected on his journey. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Every challenge, every setback, had led him to this point. And as the sun set, he felt a deep sense of peace. The future was bright, and the work was far from finished. But he was ready to keep learning, growing, and serving. The world could change one small act of kindness at a time.